And we're live. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Smart Elections Election Protection Forum. I am Lulu Freistadt. I am the Executive Director of Smart Elections.
And I am Benny Smith, the co-host. I am a Shelby County Election Commissioner, also a software developer and technical advisor for Smart Elections.
And we are really delighted to have you here with us. We have a wonderful informational and fun forum for you, just really packed with content that is important and critical to what's happening right now. So we have two guests who are going to be with us this evening. We have Dr. Alex Keyssar, who is a professor of Harvard and the Pulitzer Prize finalist of the book, The Right to Vote, which is one of my all-time favorite books about all of the different struggles that communities have gone through to vote historically in this country. It is a fascinating book. I highly recommend you pick it up if you haven't read it. And then after that, we're going to be talking to Shruti Banerjee, who is a senior policy analyst at Demos. And we're going to be talking about a piece of legislation that many of you are familiar with, that we know is very important right now. And that is the For the People Act, HR1 in the House and S1 in the Senate. It passed the House. It had the support of every single Democrat except for one. No Republican votes there. And now it's moved on to the Senate. And the question is, two questions really. Is it going to pass the Senate? And also, what are the impacts going to be? Does it need to be tweaked in some ways? So I want to really jump into it because we have a lot to cover tonight. And I want to let you know how to find us. We are at smartelections.us. And if you want to contact us, you can contact us at contact@smartelections.us. And I see that we have at least a couple people on the line. That's really awesome. We're really glad that you're here and joining us. And the first thing I want to talk about are the recommendations that Smart Elections is making in terms of HR1 S1. So we fully support this bill. This is a transformational bill that is going to make sweeping changes to our election process that are long overdue. And these are really, really important changes to really help have an inclusive democracy. These are things that people have really needed help with for a long time, to make it easier to register to vote, to make it easier to vote. And it has also some provisions for election security. We do have some concerns, especially about the election security provisions. And I'm going to just pull up a document right now that has our specific recommendations. And I'm going to talk about one of them in particular, and also give you a link where your group, if you want to sign on to support these suggested changes to HR1 S1, where you can sign a Google form to do that. So let me just see if I can add this in. We're going to get to that document actually in a minute, but I'm going to first go to our, let's see, I'm just trying a new way of sharing documents, which should be easier, but also has, I can only do so many at a time. So I'm going to first show you our policy suggestions. That's where I want to start with this. And the one that I'm going to just go over them in general. As I said, we think that the bill is very good and has some really great provisions in it. One of the things that it does is that it mandates that voters have the option to mark a ballot by hand. And one of the things that we want to do is we want to make sure that they have that option actually in the polling place. So that's one of our first recommendations, is that voters have that option to vote in the polling place. And these are, let's see, I can take you right down to that section. So we get into this document, we actually get into very specific language of the bill, but what we're trying to add into the bill here, which mandates, it says already that the voter shall have the option to mark his or her ballot by hand. But what we want to add to that is, in particular, in each polling place, if in-person voting is offered by the district. And that's very important because if you don't have that language, in the bill, then what can happen is states can meet this provision by offering mail-in voting. Voters can vote by marking their ballot by hand, by mail, but in-person voting could wind up being on touchscreen or ballot marking devices. And as we've covered multiple times in this program, those are less secure. So I don't know, do you want to bounce in on that, Benny, about why that's important to have that hand-marked paper ballot in the polling place?
Yeah, it's important to have that line of demarcation, because not to say that people will do it intentionally, but the law should be clear enough that it is mandating that the expectancy is not just one piece of the provision. If you say, well, I gave you the option, I gave it to you when I offered you to vote by mail, in states like Tennessee, where you're not eligible to vote by mail, then they can say, well, we offered people during the early voting period or during the absentee period to vote by mail, which didn't touch about 50% of the county. So by offering it in the polling place, then it's clear that the people that come into the precinct on election day have the same option.
Right. So that's one provision that we want to make sure gets included. Then the bill also has what we consider a really strong provision in that it mandates that any ballot marking device is what's called a non-tabulating ballot marking device. And that's good because this is really kind of in the weeds unless you've been following us on this, but ballot marking devices that are tabulating, meaning they count the ballots, can, if they're hacked, have the opportunity to change paper ballots because those tabulating ballot marking devices often include a printer. So we want additional language in this bill that will help make sure that after the paper ballot is cast, the voting machine never passes the cast ballot under a printer that could print votes onto the ballot. So this is just something that we've been talking about over and over and over again on this program, is that we want to make sure that these machines are designed in a way that does not make them inherently flawed. And this flaw, actually, that the paper ballot could go under the printer after the voter casts it, is something that we're seeing in almost all of the new voting machines on the market. And so we'd like this to be specifically banned. And one of the reasons is that the way the bill is actually constructed right now, there's a danger that counties might actually be forced to buy these voting machines with a bad design, or that it might seem to be mandating that. And that's simply because of the way the bill is written. In one section, it mandates the purchase of ballot marking devices that have a certain capability, and it could be interpreted as being this particular type of ballot marking device. I know that seems really complicated, but what we're saying is that we want to make sure, if we're going to pass this bill, let's get it right. Let's make sure that the machines that we're using are designed correctly. So we have language for that. And then I want to touch on one other provision that we're really concerned about. And this has to do with a provision that that is in the bill right now. And it says right now, if it passes, if HR1 passes and becomes a law, the states shall begin processing and scanning ballots cast by mail for tabulation at least 14 days prior to the date of the election involved. So what they're saying there is the states have to start processing and scanning ballots 2 weeks before election day. And this is actually just an invitation for fraud. And I wonder if you want to weigh in on this also, Benny.
Right. You want to make it as hard as possible for anyone to preview what the outcome is, right? This would be encouraging people to know what the totals are. The same with the provision of the ballot marking device being a non-tabulating. You don't want the machine calculating. You don't want it adding until election night. There should be no addition. There shouldn't be any subtraction, but there should be no addition of votes until election night.
Right. So what we're recommending in that particular provision, instead of saying we just want to cut the term and scanning, it's fine to start processing ballots ahead of time, opening envelopes, checking signatures, but we don't want any scanning. Once you're scanning, you're actually counting votes, and it's going to be very, very hard for the states to resist looking at those totals. And
let's not give anybody any. We don't want to tempt anybody.
So what I met Professor Appel and I, Professor Andrew Appel of Princeton, who's somebody that we work with quite a bit, a security expert, met with some of the staff on the Senate this week, and one of the things that Professor Appel brought up was that there actually was an incident in 2006 in Cuyahoga County where the election officials scanned the ballots ahead of time, and they did access them and they did count them. And because the Senate staff asked us, were there really any instances where this had gone, where we know that the votes were looked at ahead of time. So I want to show you this document very briefly, but this was some information that was provided by Candace Hoke, a professor of law at Cleveland Marshall College of Law. And what she said is that in 2006, in the Ohio Secretary of State granted Cuyahoga County the power to scan paper absentee ballots several days early and load the scans on flash drives. But no tabulation of cast ballots were allowed. They were not supposed to look at the totals. But in fact, prior to Election Day, the Diebold Gems was turned on, a set of cast ballot reports was printed, and then the Gems clock was changed, and then the Gems logs were wiped to eliminate these actions and the operator's identity.
It seems that everything happens in Gems.
For people who don't know, what is GEMS, Finney?
That's a global election management system. Shelby County uses that software now, and it's the inaugural program of our election equipment that we use today.
Right. So this is just the management program where the ballots are tabulated. Yeah, it's tabulation. So this is just to say, don't scan those ballots 2 weeks.
No sneak peeks, no trailer. You can't watch the trailer. You got to watch the movie.
We do not want every state being mandated to count ballots 2 weeks ahead of time. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to put into the chat the link. This is where you can actually take a look at our full position paper, and this is our HR1 S1 policy paper. And I hope that you will take a look at that. And what I also hope is that you will have your groups sign on to that and help us. If we have more groups signing on to that, it will help us persuade our representatives that we really do need to make these changes. Just a few changes. As I said, we support the bill fully as an overall transformational piece of legislation, but these are changes that we actually think are important. So please take a look at those. And now I'm really excited to move on to our next segment, and we are going to introduce to you Professor Keyssar, and we're really delighted to have him here with us. And great to have you here, Dr. Keyssar.
It's a pleasure to be here, Lou.
So I do want to encourage people to read The Right to Vote. Do you want to just tell us a little bit briefly about the book? It's a wonderful book.
Well, the book is a history of voting rights and the absence thereof from the nation's founding in the 1780s. Originally, the book went up to 2000, but then I did a second edition, which was published in 2008, 2009, and it runs through that period. And it's an attempt to really synthesize and integrate a number of different strands about the history of the right to vote and the obstacles to the expansion of the franchise, dealing not only with race and gender, which are the two most common axes of narrative, but also about class, immigration status, ethnicity, and to try to look at the story really in total. And I think a final comment that I would make about it is that when I first published the book, which was in September of 2000, just before the disputed 2000 election, which brought a fair amount of attention to it, I did not, although the analysis of the book suggested that the right to vote would always be contested and would always be the subject of conflict, I was very surprised at the degree to which the right to vote became an active source of contestation and controversy very soon after the 2000 election. So it's It's a story. I mean, I have not yet brought it up to date to 2021. I'm hoping somebody else might do that. But I think that readers would find it to be very resonant with the present.
Right. One of the things that you said to me is that you're really worried about all of these bills that are in the kind of movement right now to restrict voting rights.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think the latest Brennan Center count was that there are 253 or 254 pieces of legislation in state legislatures that are designed to restrict narrow access to the ballot box and make it more difficult for people to vote. And that's a completely predictable response to the last election, but it's also quite shocking.
And one of the things that we really want to focus right now, because we just have a few minutes, and we're really focusing on HR1, S1. And one of the things that I'm concerned about is that it is going to unfairly impact third-party candidates. And I know you've done a lot of research historically about third-party candidates and the troubles that they've had. First, I think the first thing that I want to say is just to ask, like, what do third parties contribute to the process?
Historically, and even in relatively recent years, third parties contribute new ideas, policy ideas that are outside of the mainstream. If you look, for example, at the major breakthroughs of the New Deal in the 1930s, like the idea of having social insurance or a social security system for everybody, or unemployment insurance. Those were ideas that came out of 19th century third parties. They were it took decades, 3-4 decades, for any one of the major parties to embrace these ideas. So that third parties have served as a place to incubate new ideas, as a place to give some training and experience to people who are committed and engaged in political life and want to advance particular causes, but aren't necessarily on a career ladder as politicians. And I think in some other way they serve to keep the two major parties honest, or a little honest.
I will say one thing about third parties is that they have been more proactive about election security than either of the major parties. So, for example, and I think a lot of people may not be aware of this, but after the 2016 election, it was Jill Stein and the Green Party that demanded a recount in 3 states. And one of the things that came of that is that we had paper ballots in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, prior to 2016, was voting on completely electronic voting machines. And because Jill Stein and the Green Party filed a lawsuit in Pennsylvania, all of Pennsylvania had to go to voting machines with paper ballots. And I want people to imagine what it would have been like in the 2020 election with Trump contesting Pennsylvania if there had been no paper ballots. It would have been a nightmare. So that is definitely one thing that third parties have been contributing, is they've been contributing to the election security standards around the country. A very important contribution. So I want to move on and just talk about the question, is HR1 S1 fair to third parties, and get your thoughts on that. What we covered in our last forum, we had Howie Hawkins, who is the 2020 presidential candidate for the Green Party, and he has pointed out, he's written articles and policy papers pointing out that the amount that any party will need to raise for their presidential candidate to qualify for matching funds is going to go up from 500%, from $5,000, which is the current amount that you have to raise, to $25,000 in 20 states. And the Green Party is saying that this could be like a death blow to them, really. This could knock them out.
Yeah, I mean, I can't comment on whether or not it would be a death blow. Howie Hawkins would know much better than I do about that. But certainly, it seems to be a somewhat gratuitous feature of the legislation to make it more difficult. I mean, yes, I think that we might all agree that there has to be some threshold of signatures or fundraising for someone to get matching funds. I shouldn't be able to just walk into an office and say, "Hi, I'm Alex. I'm running for office. Can you give me money?" But my own view is that the threshold should be kept as low as is feasible, and precisely in order to encourage the kind of independent and third-party actions, which I think are so vital to the development of political and policy ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's one other provision in particular that Howie pointed out, which is that the amount that the big committees, which is like the DNC, the RNC, can contribute to each presidential candidate is going up from $5,000 to $100 million. That's a huge increase in terms of money flowing from those big committees, which again is where the big donors can put their money and then get them in, sort of bypassing other restrictions that are taking place. And I wondered if you had thoughts on that.
Well, it means I'll have to give $100 million to more candidates when I have a chance. No, I think that I'll just have to dip into my savings a little bit. Look, I join you in embracing HR1, and I will do everything I can to help its passage. But this is not a campaign finance bill. This is not really a program for campaign finance reform. It does a little bit of tinkering around the edges, but it doesn't do much at all to deal with the central problem of too much money and too much unregulated money and too much unseen money in our elections. It just doesn't do that. That's gonna have to come in a separate piece of legislation if we ever get there.
And what do we need to do that? I know one thing that people say is that we need a constitutional amendment to what are your thoughts?
Well, if unless the Supreme Court has a conversion experience, which doesn't seem likely with this Supreme Court, which has ruled in effect that you can't limit expenditures because that would be a limitation on free speech, then we do need a constitutional amendment. I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but I would think that such an amendment would in fact be welcomed by broad swaths of the population. I think that the amount of money floating around in elections seems pretty obscene to just about everybody. So, again, whether there are routes short of a constitutional amendment, I know there are a lot of people in this, in the reform community who think we should try to do other things first, and maybe that's the case. But an amendment is probably the only long-term fix, because the current conservative court is not going to overturn the decisions of previous courts protecting campaign expenditures.
And if anything, they seem to be making it worse, almost sort of like decision after decision.
Right. No, exactly. I mean, on voting on issues relating to voting, the Roberts Court is moving rapidly towards the 19th century. Yes, things are getting worse. So I think that's why thinking about an amendment is very much worth doing.
Wow. And Benny, you have any final thoughts or question for Professor Keyssar?
No, I think this is fabulous information. It's really clear and concise. I have to read the book. I haven't seen it. I might have to join you in writing that 2021 copy. It definitely needs to be updated to 2021.
No, I know that. And my publisher thinks it needs to be actually, what we've been remarkable about is that the book has actually sold extremely well in the last year, even though the most recent edition was in 2009.
Yeah. It's all relevant still.
Alas.
Well, this has just been really fascinating, and I really, really value your thoughts, and I think that you've really contributed significantly here. I know that I'm thinking about some new things now too, just in terms of some of the seeds that you've planted here. So thank you so much for joining us. It's really a pleasure to have you here.
Sure, it's been a pleasure to be involved in this discussion, so thank you.
All right.
Bye.
So, okay, so actually what I want to do now, I have a clip queued up, and this is a clip from a documentary that I made that actually features Dr. Keyssar, and I am going to see if we can play this now. I'm going to watch the comments, and if you're not hearing any audio, tell me right away. This is a new way that we're playing these clips.
I had breakfast at Kareem's Deli. I wanted to talk with him about other reasons that he doesn't vote. We've already gone over his concerns about the Electoral College, but reason number 2, his real beef, was that the candidate he wanted to vote for wasn't on the ballot.
I wanted to vote actually for Nader, but since I couldn't vote for him, so I just decided not to vote at all.
What do you like about Nader?
He's a very smart man. I hear a lot of his interviews and it makes sense to me, everything he says.
People have been registering more as independent.
1/3 of all registered voters in this country are not members of the Republican or the Democratic Party.
But the fact is that in a lot of races, they don't have candidates.
Historically, in Pennsylvania, there have been a lot of third parties. In fact, up until the early 20th century, you would typically see 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 candidates on the statewide ballot.
Throughout our history, it was only these little parties that got the ball rolling. The anti-slavery party, the women's right to vote party in the 19th century, labor, farm party.
Having lots of candidates on the ballot had another advantage: high voter turnout.
Turnout levels are around 80% in the late 19th century. That is considered something of the high water mark in American political participation.
But then they started putting in their laws. They were originally designed to protect us from the communists in the 30s.
Various states passed laws making it increasingly difficult for third parties to get on the ballot.
So you'll see that starting around 1920, 1930, there are no third-party candidates running for statewide office in Pennsylvania.
So that was a film that I directed and produced. It's called Holler Back: Not Voting in an American Town. And you're welcome to check that out at the website, hollerbackfilm.com. And that was how I met Dr. Keyssar, actually. I interviewed him for that film. And we're going to play one more clip of that a little bit later on. So we're just going to talk a little bit now about some of the ways that you can help support all of this really important work and get involved and make sure that our elections are getting better every day, every month. So the first thing you can do is you are our PR machine. So we are all over the place. We're on Twitter. Benny and I are both on Twitter also. We have our handles up here, all the time throughout the show. And we're on Facebook. We're on Instagram. We are on TikTok. And one of the things that we would love is if you would join our social media team. So we're actually going to start a social media team, and we're going to have a volunteer meetup next Tuesday. And if you want to sign up for that, you can go to countthevote.info. That's our data site. And we would just love to have you there, because you can see that Benny and I are really busy. Benny's doing 4 jobs and raising a family. How many jobs do you have now, Benny?
About 17.
Give us a few.
Shoot, I do stuff in the music industry. I do analytics for finance. I do election work. I do a lot of stuff.
You're an election commissioner?
Yeah, I'm election commissioner too.
You help us. So we're really busy, and it would be so helpful to us if we had more people on social media getting this message out. Then we can do more research, more advocating and informing legislators. So it would really help us. And as I said, we're going to have this meeting on March 16th, and we'd love it for you to join our social media team. And now we are going to talk about money.
And give up to $100 million.
Yes, instead of giving it to the RNC or the DNC, we'd like you to throw some our way. We really, really do need your support. We had some great donations this week. Thank you so much to people who contributed. After I sent the newsletter out, we got some donations in. It makes us feel great, and it really helps us. We are trying to scale up, bring on more staff, and really do a tremendous amount of work. This is work that no other organization is doing. We are informing the public about details of our election process that almost no one else is really going into. We are advocating and informing legislators. We are also working state by state to help people pick better voting machines. We are just doing we have a whole philosophy and a whole set of actions that we're taking, and we base it on our 4 pillars. And we're doing stuff that no one else is doing. But what do we need? We need you to help us.
Sometimes we get sued.
We did get the threat of a lawsuit from ES&S, which tells you that we are really doing something that other people aren't doing, which is we are making a difference in those voting machines, because we're impactful enough that one of the vendors actually came after us. So please do go to our website, smartelections.us, and make a donation. All of the donations are tax deductible. And you know what? We would like for you to give as much as you can, and also think about who you know. Maybe you don't have $1 million, but maybe someone you know does. And maybe you can let them know that there's this new nonprofit, nonpartisan organization working on election reform that's doing really proactive work that no other group is doing, and maybe they'd like to support us. And you can let us know about that if you go to smartelections.us, or if you just shoot us an email, contact@smartelections.us.
Also, if you know any organizations that are providing grants to voting organizations, there's so many organizations now that are trying to look for people who are looking at the issues the right way, and they're willing to grant and give money. So if you know of any places like that, please let us know so we can reach out to them.
We really, really do appreciate it. One of the things about our group that is, I think, a little different is that we're actually nonpartisan. And there are a lot of groups that say that they're nonpartisan, but you can tell that they really have partisan actions. But we really make an effort to really work in a transpartisan way, bridging communities, bringing different groups together. We're going to have a cross-partisan convergence later in the summer, and we're starting conversations between the disability community and the security community that no one has ever started before. We're doing stuff out here, and we need your help. So please do support us. We're going to play one more clip now. This also features Dr. Keyssar, but we're going to transition to our next guest, Shruti Banerjee. And this is a particular clip. This is also from the same film that I made, Holler Back. And this was an interview that I did with a former felon who was not allowed to vote, and really felt strongly about it. It was very hurtful to him.
Leaving the 7-Eleven, I checked my messages. I had put in a call earlier to meet up with another non-voter. His name was Maurice, and he was an ex-felon.
How can I put it? Convicted of a sex offense.
When was the last time that you voted?
I didn't vote.
You've never voted?
Laws barring convicted felons from voting are considered constitutional. They have become particularly significant in the last 25 or 30 years with the enormous growth of our population of convicted felons.
What issue was important to you that you wanted to vote about?
Pretty much the whole thing, how everything's run. Everybody that broke the law gets some sort of first-hand experience seeing how the system runs and everything. And a lot of them know that it ain't run right.
By committing a felony, you infringed on someone's rights somewhere, so you should lose some of your own.
It's a racist issue.
In some states, we're talking about 1 out of 5 minority males is disfranchised.
For over 10 years, a majority of the U.S. public has supported restoring voting rights to felons who have completed their sentences.
As soon as they're completely free of all obligations to the legal system, they should be reinstated and be able to vote again.
Would you have felt more connected to your community if you could have voted?
Yeah, I would have felt that I'd have did something for my community.
So that was really a learning experience for me. It was definitely something that I suspected that someone who had been deprived the right to vote would really feel strongly about it. But I actually, when I interviewed Maurice, it was it really did make a strong impression on me, how much he cared about it, how much he had thought about it. He had tried multiple times to register to vote and was prevented. So we have a guest now who's going to talk to us about this and other things that HR1 S1 might be able to remedy. And so I'm really delighted to have her here. Let's see if I can get us into a better format. There we go. Hi. This is Shruti Banerjee. She is a senior policy analyst at Demos, and it is they're a really powerful organization. They put out really, really wonderful policy work, and they put out. I'm going to make sure that we send the slide deck that they put out to the entire mailing list. This is their website, and it's wonderful to have you here, Shruti.
Thank you so much for having me and for taking the time to address this issue. I know this is a very different sphere and a different topic than what's usually addressed here, so I'm really grateful to be here.
It's great. So why don't we first just talk a little bit about racial equity. Like, what is racial equity? It's a term that we're sort of hearing become a little bit of a buzzword. What does that mean?
Well, in terms of our United States democracy, racial equity means having equal access to the ballot box regardless of the color of your skin. And it sounds really simple, but it's unfortunately not a right that has been granted to all Americans, because our democracy was really originally designed by white landowning men for white landowning men. And even as other groups fought to participate in our democracy, including African Americans and women, every bit of this progress had been met with really strong resistance that has now culminated in the form of voter suppression laws. And despite the really well-documented legislative history here that points to the blatantly racist intention behind some of these laws, they're still on the books today. And because we have been unable to eradicate many of these laws that have had these racist intentions, our long racist history has continued to disenfranchise Black and brown voters. So within the terms of US democracy, that's really what racial equity means for us.
And I'm really hoping that you're going to walk us through a little bit of that. Like, what is the racist history of our elections?
So, well, as I briefly noted, we were definitely a democracy created by white landowning men. And after African Americans were given the right to vote, numerous laws to prevent them from actually getting to the ballot box were instated. And these range from felony disenfranchisement laws that were specifically targeting Black and brown communities. These include strict voter registration rules that would prevent Black communities from actually getting the right documentation needed to register. Includes voter ID laws, racist voter purges that were intended or designed to knock Black and brown voters off the rolls before elections, as well as racist redistricting laws. And, I was going to say, through our history, Black and brown voters and actually activists have been able to fight through these exclusions. And it's important to note this has been going on since the Reconstruction era. We had the Reconstruction Amendments. Then in the 60s, we had the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. More recently, we've had to continue fighting. We had the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, and then the reauthorization of the VRA in 2006 was among other big wins. But what's important is that this fight is nowhere near over, and we see this being more important now more than ever when we see, as the previous speaker, Professor Keyssar, had noted, there's a large wave of voter suppression bills that have been recently introduced. So we know that the racist history is continuing to plague our democracy today.
So, and you're breaking up a little bit. So I'm going to suggest just make sure that you, I think, talk slowly, and then that way we'll make sure to get each of the things you're saying, because these are really important moments in our history, and I want to make sure that we're catching these. So, for example, I'm on Twitter, and I follow a lot of conservatives and progressives and people, as I said, across the political spectrum. And one of the things that I see coming up, I saw a tweet from a conservative that I follow, and he said that he made it seem like it was almost patronizing to voters of color or people of color to make sort of special accommodations for them. Like, are they like so challenged somehow that they can't get to the, voter registration, to the Board of Elections and register? Like, is it insulting to them, or is it something else?
I mean, I'm so sorry I couldn't get through that without smiling while hearing that, because it just blatantly ignores all the tactics that were purposely instated to prevent communities of color from voting. And it's so blatant when we saw, for example, in the last election, in the primaries, voting locations in Milwaukee, for example, went from 180 polling places to just 5 in the area that had the largest Black voting base. These are historical things that we've seen happen. Polling places put in inaccessible locations, voting made inaccessible, registration deadlines and dates and necessary documents purposely designed to ensure that certain communities can't get registered in time or don't have the proper documentation. So it kind of blatantly ignores not only the legislative history, but the impact that many of these laws have had and that have disproportionately impacted Black and Brown communities, as well as other marginalized groups that have prevented them. So to say that it's almost like condescending to these groups it's silly to act like we were ever on a level playing field in a democracy that has so embedded white supremacy into our system.
And I believe there was even a court decision that said that some of these laws were designed with surgical precision to knock Black and Brown voters off the rolls. It was in North Carolina.
Sorry. My apologies of my mute button. There's actually multiple cases where we have seen voter ID laws knocked down with very strong language like that. But despite the fact we've been able to knock them down in certain states, that doesn't mean that another state won't pick up a similar regulation or a similar voter suppression tactic.
And there's a huge wave of these new voter suppression bills.
There is, as Professor Keyssar actually gave the exact number, as of mid-February, we've seen well over 250 bills in 43 states that are designed specifically to restrict voting rights. And these include more restrictive voter purges, restrictions to absentee ballot voting, more voter ID laws, and more laws that actually restrict voter registration, like, for example, making sure there isn't automatic voter registration in certain states. And that's what makes HR1 so much more important, because it does address a lot of the new wave of bills that are coming up in these states. I will say, to be fair, there have been over 700 bills that expand voting rights as well in these states. But I would be remiss to note that a lot of these states do have legislatures that it's entirely possible they can pass very harsh restrictions before the next federal election.
So let's just talk about how we think that HR1 S1 is going to help. And I think maybe, is this a good time to show some of the slide deck that Demos had prepared? Some of those slides? Okay, so let me just pull that up. I think that
yeah, we definitely won't be able to knock out every single provision that does help with racial equity. But just to list a few that we won't be able to deep dive into, but are a part of the slide deck, so there are more stats on this in there. HR1 includes provisions to make absentee ballots more accessible, to promote fair redistricting, to nullify the racist voter ID laws, to prevent bias voter purges, among other reforms. And two of the big ones we want to highlight today are the provisions that really really modernize voter registration, as well as provisions that help felony disenfranchise or help people convicted of previous crimes restore their voting rights.
Okay, so we'll dive into the voter registration, but just you had your whole list there of all the things it's going to do. So just say those slowly and carefully, if you will. What are some of these categories where we think that HR1 S1 is going to help us with the issue of racial disenfranchisement?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry about that. I got really excited and listed them all out of pure excitement. But some of the big ones are making voting more accessible by mail, absentee ballots, expanding those provisions, promoting fair redistricting, nullifying the voter.
I'm just going to go through these just a little bit more slowly with you. So fair redistricting, it's basically setting up commissions to end, if we can, gerrymandering, sort of this whole way that the Congress makes sure that everybody in their district supports them and that they get reelected no matter what. Right, so that's the gerrymandering provision. And then you said before that, it's an expansion of absentee ballot voting?
Yes, absolutely. So to ensure that states that have severely restricted absentee ballot voting to ensure that people who need them can get their absentee ballots.
So it's basically no excuse absentee voting in all states.
Yes.
Okay, next up.
And then we are completely just we're nullifying the really discriminatory voter ID laws. And another big one that Demos and we work on at Demos is getting rid of the very biased voter purges. And that specifically means we call it the Ohio style rule because that's where the litigation took place. It essentially
the Ohio what?
The Ohio style rule, the Ohio use it or lose it rule, because what happens there is if you don't vote in 2 federal elections and then you don't respond to a mail confirmation notice, they're allowed to knock you off the voter roll, which has had a disproportionate impact on minority communities because there's so many reasons why you couldn't make it to vote. Long voter waiting lines, you didn't get time off of work, the polling place was inaccessible, or you showed up, you couldn't get in, or your voter registration for some reason wasn't matching. There are so many reasons why certain communities couldn't make it to vote or didn't vote in 2 federal elections. And just because you didn't vote doesn't mean your right to vote should be rescinded all of a sudden. So, but this is unfortunately the Supreme Court ruled something that is allowed to happen, and states have now adopted similar rules. So the voter purge provision is very important to us to ensure that people can stay on the rolls and aren't scared that they might not be on them because they didn't vote in a federal election prior.
That's great, right? Because it's basically self-reinforcing. You didn't vote. We made it hard for you to vote, and now we're not going to let you vote because we made it hard for you to vote. So.
That's exactly what it is. And honestly, the confirmation notice thing, they act like it's so normal. And I was like, most people do not catch confirmation notices in their mail. You get a stack of mail, most of which is ads now at this point in life. And to go through and find a tiny flyer in a stack of mail is nearly impossible. Or it might not even have the right address, the way states keep their
I'm on with bills. That's it.
Yeah, right. And I don't want to look at my bills. How many of us do that? But it's not a crazy thing.
I don't want you to see my mail right now. It's terrible.
You're gonna get purged.
I might. So should we talk about the voter registration?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And
so this is an issue where we think that the bill will definitely help.
Absolutely. So voter registration actually was a historic tool and has long been weaponized by those in power to prevent communities of color from voting. It was in fact in its history invented in part to ensure that Black people, working people, and immigrants couldn't get the right documentation and couldn't even register to vote. And because of that, it has ended up resulting in longstanding and in some cases significant disparities and in registration rates between races and ethnicities. So what this graph that we put up shows is that while 70% of white non-Latinx voting eligible population registered, only 64% of the Black eligible voting population, 54% of the Latinx voting eligible population, and 53% of the Asian American population were able to register. And this is not because Black and brown people are less interested in being registered and voting. It's because this registration has always been a tool of voter suppression. And we know that because once people do register, we actually see extraordinarily high voter turnout amongst these groups that once they're registered end up getting to vote. And so what HR1 does to help eradicate some of these problems, it is in states online voter registration, automatic voter registration, and same-day registration, which would help eliminate these disparities and ensure that voter registration no longer plays a role in disenfranchising these voters. So automatic voter registration would make sure that these agencies would register the voters by various means. Sorry, my dog is jumping up on my sofa.
Yay! The dog is here.
He's very excited about same-day registration as well. He thinks it should happen because when people show up especially during COVID, the COVID crisis caused such a bad housing crisis that a lot of people's registrations no longer matched up with the date, the address they had on their original registration. I apologize. But with same-day registration, if you show up to vote, you will be able to register that day at the polling place and your vote can still count. So these provisions are incredibly important to at least eradicate that one barrier of registration.
So this is a same-day registration, every state mandated.
Yeah.
That's huge. Absolutely huge.
Yeah. Sorry, go for it.
Let me ask you a question also. Now, automatic voter registration is basically you interact with an agency, you go down, you wind up, I don't know, the DMV is the classic one, but there's lots of other state agencies healthcare agencies, you know, that might, like New York has a New York State Health Exchange. Like, my understanding with automatic voter registration is there'll be a list of state or federal agencies where if you interact with that agency, they will automatically register you to vote. That's why it's called automatic voter registration. Now, let me ask you something that one of our conservative guests said on our last forum. She was very concerned about kind of the bureaucratic nightmare this could create if you have like 10, 15, 20 different agencies all over the country and they're all registering you to vote. Maybe you're somebody who is in New York in the winter and is in Florida in the summer, and you wind up being registered in 2 states accidentally, or like, is there going to be a little bit of a bureaucratic hurdle to overcome here? And have people been thinking about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that we've actually seen. Multiple states have already instated similar provisions. And I would be lying if I said there was never going to be any kind of bureaucratic hurdle for something related to government agencies. But to say that it's such a big hurdle and it's not possible would be also completely inaccurate, because we've seen in the states that have instated automatic voter registration, and certain agencies have asked to be a part of the system that registers voter. They've actually, and abiding by these regulations, have increased the amount of voter registration, particularly amongst brown and Black communities, because they interact with a lot of these agencies more than they would seek out a different method of actually going to register to vote. So yes, there's bureaucracy with everything. Using that as an excuse to not actually instate a policy that has been proven to work in multiple states is not an excuse, especially when this policy has been proven to help level the playing field in the United States democracy, which is inherently uneven right now.
And then
I got a question from the same day registration. Well, go ahead, Lulu.
Let's just take this and then we'll put you on stack, Benny. So, and this is something that I think is in the bill. This is from one of our listeners. Jana is saying HR1 should demand sufficient precinct resources so that no one has to wait in line for hours to vote. And that actually is in the bill.
Yeah, there are actually multiple different funding provisions within the bill that would help with that. Actually, funds can be allocated from those systems to that. And something that we had actually discussed earlier too includes funding for really revamping the systems, and that would help with that, to shorten precinct lines, to really revamp election systems. And one of the systems that they had pushed that doesn't actually, HR1 doesn't increase the amount of ranked choice voting, but to modernize these systems, to give the funding to modernize these systems would increase the amount of states that could pave the way for ranked choice voting in other forms. And it would definitely, if they modernize voting at these precincts and use this funding properly, the intention is that it will shorten precinct lines.
I think there's a mandate in the bill that the line cannot be more than 30 minutes long. Is that correct?
I don't know if it's exactly 30 minutes, so I would have to double check, but there is some specific language for sure.
Yeah, because we looked at it because that was one of our policy recommendations. We'd actually like to include a line monitor for voters with disabilities, or because we work with the disability community a lot. But we're really excited about that provision. The line length is supposed to be no more than 30 minutes, and we think that's great. Benny, you had something?
Yeah, I was having a conversation earlier today. If you had 4 machines of 40 placeholders for paper ballots, that would alleviate the lines. But the question that I had was with same day registration. There's a little bit of nuance there for me that takes a little unpacking. Same day registration is a hurdle because you have your election administrators and the staff who has been prepared solely for conducting the election. If you have people coming in registering, then where do the resources come for? I don't know how people do same day registration. It seems like it'd be a little convoluted on election day when you're trying to run the election. You're trying to process all these paper absentee ballots, but then you have people that you have to clear through and verify so that they can participate and vote.
Yeah, so in the states that have actually instated these, they've worked to make sure that the people who are working at the ballot box area, or the people who are working at the polling stations, are trained in understanding how to register voters and work with these provisional ballots for same-day registration. And so it definitely complicates it slightly when you have to register at the ballot box, or when you show up at the polling station and you don't have that. But it is better than showing up at the polling station, not having proper registration, and then having no option whatsoever and being unable to vote that day, even by provisional ballot.
Okay, so it functions like a provisional ballot?
Yeah, so sometimes if they can't vary, this varies from state to state, but provisional ballots are often given if they can't, for example, if you are in a certain precinct or you just moved and they haven't gotten your updated information yet and they can't verify, you can often vote by provisional ballot. So for example, when I left my last neighborhood, and I moved to my new neighborhood, I had registered a little too late and I was able to use a provisional ballot, and that ballot was able to count once they verified my registration.
Okay. Well, that would be tremendous with voter purges, because if you purge me, I can just register again.
That it's actually one of the biggest fixes to voter purges. When people, it's often the problem when people get purged, they don't know
until it's time to vote that they've been purged. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I just want to clarify, what you're saying is that same-day registration voters would vote as a regular voter, or all same-day registration is voting as a provisional ballot, or it's going to vary state to state?
No, sorry, I meant the current rules vary state to state about how you can do same-day registration, and the use of provisional ballots in different states varies. But I believe I would have to double check to make sure I'm 100% right. The way same-day registration works is that they would, if they're unable to verify, you would use a provisional ballot.
But what I don't understand, if they're able to verify what, because you're registering that day. So what is there to verify? That you live in that that you live in that you live where you say you live?
So, when you go in to vote, they're like, do you have your district card and do you have your registration card, kind of thing? And you go to your specific table based on your polling place.
Right.
If you're not on their list of people who are there, that means unable to verify.
Right. So it'd be some proof of registration and residency, right? It's a basic registration requirements just at the polling place.
Right. I guess I'll look into that more. I'm curious about that. And now,
Me too.
Because if your same-day registration would imply that you're coming to the polls, you've never registered before, you don't have your district card, you don't have anything because you never registered. Now you're going to go that day and register. Are you going to get to vote as a regular counted vote, or is it going to be provisional ballot? Yeah. Or is that something that we need to explore more?
There's some nuance there.
I was going to say, I'm pretty sure it's a provisional ballot, but I will double check and run that by you. I'm pretty sure you would only get a provisional ballot if they can't verify.
Okay, so that's something, and that's actually what our listeners are saying. So we'll look into that, and we appreciate bringing that up. We just have like 3 minutes, and Shruti has to go and take her dog to the vet right at 8. So I want to at least cover one other thing that we did talk about, which was, what does the bill not do? You talked about how it does not actually create ranked choice voting. It's to explore that, but not to create it. And then also, what's the impact on the DC statehood movement from this bill?
Sorry, I will definitely get to those two questions. I just wanted to address one of them that popped up in the comments. It said that Republican friends say the same-day registration invites voter fraud. How would we address that? And in the states that we have same-day registration, that's been proven blatantly false. There's no data whatsoever to prove that's happened. It's actually been the opposite, to say that we have no evidence whatsoever of extensive voter fraud. And it's kind of frustrating with these arguments when we've literally just had an insurrection about people stating feelings about these things without any logical math backing behind it. For example, arguing that absentee ballots are causing voter fraud or absentee ballots are fake, when clearly the math checked out, and then we had a literal insurrection by it. So that's another one of those issues where there's no evidence whatsoever that it causes voter fraud. But back to the questions that Lulu had just asked. For DC statehood, HR1 does not establish DC statehood, but what it does is it laid the groundworks and includes findings to support DC statehood, which was really huge when HR1 first passed in March 2019, because Congress had never endorsed statehood at that point. And then the House had subsequently, in June 2020, passed HR 51, which actually does establish DC statehood. And HR 51 is currently still a standalone, moving it on its own track through Congress. But HR1 doesn't establish it, but it is it lays the groundwork for further legislation to establish it. And very similar to ranked choice voting, except this bill actually does allocate funding that it supports and says should go towards building systems that support ranked choice voting.
Okay, so support for in the bill, but not actually creating DC statehood or creating ranked choice voting. So just support. Okay, and then I know we just have 1 minute, but I know we really wanted to get to felony enfranchisement, and why don't we just let's go ahead. We talked about voter registration, and I know that this was a really important one to you, and to me also. Obviously, you could tell from my interview with Maurice that I care about this a lot.
Yeah, this is a really big one for us. And because this is one of those that has one of the most jarring legislative histories, and it's so important because it drastically differs from state to state how these laws function. In certain states, such as Maine and Vermont, which are two of the demographically whitest states, there's no felony disenfranchisement whatsoever. Everyone in jail or prison has the right to vote, has access to the ballot. If they want to vote, they can, and their vote would be counted back where they were initially in their community where they're from. So they would still have the right to have a say in the lives and the values of their families and friends. But in other states, they drastically differ, and people have lost their vote even while they're on parole and probation. For example, California only recently voted to ensure that people who have been released and have their rights restored. And what HR1 does is ensure that everyone who's been released has their rights restored upon release.
And we know that we know from study after study that people of color are more often to be targeted for arrest, more likely to be incarcerated if they are arrested, more likely to have longer penalties. We know that all of the criminal justice system falls with a heavier weight on people of color. And so these laws that disenfranchise former felons are definitely targeting people of color.
It's been proven statistically over and over again, and we see the impact of it today. And with it's one of those things too, where you read the legislative history and it's like, this was so obviously racist. They're not even trying to hide it. And yet we keep these laws on the books today, and they've continued to have this impact. And the numbers are just jarring, where it's the 35% of the disenfranchised population are African American, whereas the whole entire population in the country is only 13%. So they're by far disproportionately represented in the disenfranchised population. And it's also jarring to know that this bill would re-enfranchise 1.7 million voters. And that is a significant portion of people who have been unable to have a say, as we've seen in the video, in their lives, in the rules that govern even the criminal justice system that's impacted them, which is important because right now we see people becoming billionaires in a state like Colorado or California because of marijuana companies. And then at the same time, you have young boys who have lost their right to vote because they've been caught with marijuana. And this is the same country.
Right. So the laws are different state to state. And so that can also impact who winds up having their rights taken away from them, the right to vote. All right. Well, this is really, really fascinating. And I'm going to put the link in the chat to there's a whole slide deck that Demos has put together with all kinds of research about this. I'm going to put that in the chat. And I will send it out to the mailing list. Also, we had a bunch of other questions and stuff. You've obviously really...
I'm looking at these questions and I was like, I want to answer all of them. These are such good conversation points.
We could stay a few more minutes.
Yeah. But can I just say, I love these questions. I will, if this kid doesn't get a shot tonight, this is on democracies. This is democracy.
We want your dog to get his shot. Okay, we can stay a few more minutes. So go ahead and pick what you want to answer, Shruti, and we'll put these questions up. We have a really great participatory audience, and I love that about it.
I love this. And I love how critically they're thinking about it, because from our perspective, I'm speaking from the Demos perspective. We obviously support a bill that's going to push racial equity, but I love that they're pointing this out, because we have to acknowledge this is not a cure-all. This is not going to solve racism for us. This is not going to actually eradicate all the problems. And I love the point that was made about provisional ballots, because that's a big area of data that we've been digging into. And we've been trying to work with states to understand, why weren't these ballots counted? What measures can we instate to ensure that there's better ways to check and count these provisional ballots? And we have unfortunately seen in a few states where provisional ballots weren't counted, they were disproportionately Black and brown ballots that were not counted. So this is, I love that that this was pointed out, and it is a big area that we are still working on and trying to understand more.
So now tell me what questions from the comments you want to try to address. We got some pretty spicy people here.
I know, this is exciting.
Yeah, we got a good group. They critical thinkers.
Yeah, I hit the one with the provisional ballots. Register to vote when you turn 19, voter card issued to you. So I agree with the 18 one. That would happen in certain agencies, but not all of them. Like, for example,
I'm
the
sorry,
DMV.
tell me the comment so I can put it up for our viewers.
Sorry, why not a system where you're automatically registered to vote when you turn 18 and a voter ID card is issued to you? It's a great idea. And some agencies will automatically register you. For example, like the California DMV, once you turn 18, once you re-register or you get your work, they will ask if you, or you get check a little box to see if you want to register. And they make it that simple. But I think that's a really good idea and something that we can continue to push for. Same day registration. Yes, I think that I've hit, sorry, I'm just running through a few of these questions. Let me know if you see any that I haven't hit yet. A few of them are similar. I will say Puerto Rico statehood is something that Demos has been advocating for as well, but unfortunately it has not made it into this. Yeah.
And then one question that we had, and this was from my husband actually, he wanted to know what's the enforcement? How are these going to be enforced?
Yeah, absolutely. So for enforcement, states will be, if the bill passes, of course, states will be required to comply with the provisions in the bill and with respect to all federal elections. This only regulates federal elections because of the congressional mandate, but whatever timeline is specified for each provision. But for the states that don't, which we often see when we pass this kind of legislation, for the states that don't end up complying with this, enforcement will likely come in the form of legal action from the Department of Justice. And this depends on the administration and whether or not the department is taking on or inclined to pursue these types of voting right cases, which they have in the past. But we also litigation would come in the form of private litigants, such as our own organization like Demos and the ACLU, who often end up suing states who don't comply with the federal policies they should be complying with.
So it's going to be litigation. It'll be in the courts.
It's likely going to be litigation. Yeah.
All right. And I do want to just go ahead and put up a comment. Just to show this is not the Black community is not a monolith. Not everybody, across different communities have the same opinions. We're all individuals. And this is someone who's pushing back and doesn't agree with the policies. Her comments are very clear. Karen's comments in the chat that she doesn't agree with the bill. And she says also try to board a plane or go to a DNC convention without an ID. Get off of the race card as a Black woman, I'm offended. So I think, Karen, what you're saying there is that you had no problem getting an identification and you don't think that this is necessary and it sounds like you strongly disagree with some of these provisions in the bill. So it's not one that everybody agrees with. They're going to have a tough time getting it through the Senate in terms of most likely not going to get any Republican support. They got every single Democrat in the House except for one to vote for it. So they got through the House. In the Senate, if they get every single senator and they make some changes to the filibuster, they can get it through, I believe, right?
Yeah, but it's very unlikely because of the filibuster. We would be very surprised. It would be wonderful if it got through, but because of the filibuster, I doubt it will get through.
Wow. So because we're really thinking that it is going to get through. We've heard that Manchin is going to be. They think that Manchin can be persuaded. They think that they can get the 50 votes, and that there's sort of like some fine tuning that can go on. I've actually been reading articles about how the filibuster has changed multiple times throughout history, and that they could make a change to the filibuster that it only. That it doesn't apply to rules about elections, to rules about the rules, and they could get it through that way. That a slight modification of the filibuster rule could get this through, and that they're toying with that. So we've definitely heard that there's going to be a big push here to get it through.
I'm cautiously optimistic, but I'm going to take your energy and optimism. But it's true that there are a few fixes and there are ways that they can do it. I just don't know if the filibuster rule is going to change in time before Senate takes this up. But I really hope it does.
And what's their window? When do they have to get it done by?
I don't actually know when they have to get it done by. You can leave a bill forever. You can just leave it in the process of being considered forever. But I actually don't know the deadline. I would have to check.
I'm sorry. You said the Senate's going to go on a break.
So no, I said before. I don't know if they're going to amend it before Senate looks at it or takes it up. I'm not sure.
Oh, I see the filibuster. Okay. Well, you've been amazingly informative. You walked us through so many different parts of the bill and what it does and doesn't do. And we're really, really grateful to you. It's just wonderful to be in touch with you. Thank you so much for being here, Shruti.
Yeah, thank you. And I just wanted to apologize. I see some comments that I didn't in any way want to offend anyone. The research that we do is not treating any community of color like a monolith. We are really just doing impact analysis of certain bills to see where there is large impact in certain communities. And we don't think that one person's story is going to be the exact same thing as other people's story. And what we're trying to build is a culmination of historic woes. So we are in no way trying to speak down to any voters of color in any way, shape, or form.
Also for Karen, we had a different segment when we had a conservative person to give a different perspective. This is just different perspectives, right? So we are trying to give the whole picture and analyze it from each parts, and your focus is obviously in the areas where it is a problem. I am in the deep South. I'm in Tennessee, where the voter ID laws are a little bit too much here. If you have a voter ID card, that should be enough. You had to go through everything. You had to give your firstborn, the social security number, and a bunch of other stuff just to get the voter ID card. Why is that not enough to vote? And it's a monetary aspect down here where people can't afford. You got people who can't afford to pay for the voter for the ID, and they don't need ID for really anything else, and they're not flying. So there are going to be some pockets of these jurisdictions where the flight example doesn't apply. So it's a lot of nuance there. I actually disagree with. I actually think you need voter ID. But I see areas where that doesn't apply. So we need to be able to kind of take the nuance that's necessary to see that in some jurisdictions it applies, in some others it doesn't apply.
Shruti, what is the specific voter ID law? And then we'll let you go, I promise. But is there no voter ID required?
I was about to say, I have to leave, and I'm so sorry.
Okay,
but I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
We'll get you back.
We'll look it up.
I told you, I warned Lulu before. I could talk about this forever. I really could, and I'm so sorry. I have.
We could too.
It's great to have you here. Thank you so much. Get your dog to the vet, and we'll talk to you soon. Okay, take care.
Apologies. Thank you so much for having me.
She warned me. She was like, I have to get my dog to the vet. And I was like, we'll have you out of here by 8 on the nose. And obviously we went long. So we just had a lot of comments about this. And it's great. It's that people are, really passionately speaking their mind. And that's what we need. That's what democracy is. It's a dialogue. And that's what we try to really foster here, is a dialogue, and where this is a different type of program where you're not going to hear like everything that you're not going to be in
talking points here.
Your safe bubble where you only hear people who agree with you. This is actually really, as we say, this is what democracy looks like.
That's right.
So we're going to sign off. We did go long tonight, but I do want to make sure that you are coming back. So we've got some information for you about the next forums coming up.
Yep. So check us out, please, guys. This is really dense content. We have some of the foremost people that are domain experts. We're bringing them to you every other week. It's dense content. It's so informative. Our next one is March the 23rd. So tell a friend to show up and learn something. You can contribute too. You see, we'll have it out in the comments section if we need to.
Sign up for it at smartelections.us. And like I said, this is what democracy looks like. So we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thank you so much.
Good night, everybody.